Extras. When the Kuo-toa carrying Ba'ob's message arrived at Corso's Chasm, the party was hanging out in the lab space Corso had provided them, watching Draven tinkering with their magic gear, when they heard a commotion from outside. They rushed out to find most of the small city's people lining the streets to see a KT so far from the coast. The messenger had all his masterwork gear, but his short sword was sheathed with a wax seal across the hilt, such that if he drew his weapon, the seal would be clearly broken. That, and the fact that he came into town in plain sight without using his insidious invisibility cloak, showed a clear intention to be peaceful. But whereas coastal dwarves were grudgingly used to such dealings, he was still drawing quite a bit of attention here. He walked over to one of the dwarven guards and quietly told him that he had a message from Ba'ob to be delivered in person to the Dawn. However, in the interest of discretion, and any potential political concerns about being seen as too close to the Illud, the messenger said he was getting a room at a certain inn. He instructed that if the Dawn was open to meeting, he should send a guard to the inn's bar, have him order a beer, drink it at normal speed, then wipe his face with a red handkerchief, stand up and return to the tunnels of Corso's dwarfhold, in which case the messenger, who would observe this while hidden, would follow the guard invisibly. Angel, of course, managed to overhear this, so she got to see that once inside the dwarf hold, the messenger broke invis, because again, he was trying to demonstrate his trustworthiness. Don Corso more or less insisted on a parade to honor the party as they left town, headed for Vistria with the spoons. They got him to tone it down, but the company of the Orc Slayer were still cheered like heroes by townspeople gathered all along their route. However, the Illud Messenger was leaving town ahead of them, remaining visible but using the presence of the heroes to mostly sneak through the racially varied crowds. Until, that is, an armored elf stepped out ahead of him, causing a separate stir the party witnessed up ahead of them. 7-foot height is not that abnormal for elves, but this particular elf had the kind of physical, looming presence that caused the crowd to part instantly, forming a wide circle around him, and even this proud Kuo-toa balked before him. Sturmgewehr. Illud. What house are you? Hesitating a moment, glancing around to see if there were more threats, or perhaps even looking for a path of escape, the messenger turned back to the elven bounty hunter, staring him straight in the eyes. I am Vaduno, of House Undu. The elf glared down at his multi-layered pupils for a moment, then turned and strode deliberately away. After a moment, but before he got too far, Vaduno regained his nerve and called after him, "And which house would have been the wrong answer?" Sturmgewehr paused a second, almost mid-step, but then continued on without turning, and everyone went on their way. Later, when they returned to Bankton, Angel asked her contact if he had any more information about the elf known as Executioner. There wasn't good, corroborated info, but from what Hood had heard, Auric had joined the organization after his family had been killed by Kuo-toa around 400 years ago, when the Civil War had broken out, and the Illud faction had declared peace with the land nations, and particularly with the elves, in the conference at Blue Mountain. Sturmgewehr had been outraged, and was even more pissed off that the organization declared a temporary halt to any interference or strikes against the Illud until their true intentions could be discovered and tested. In the years that followed, the organization has found evidence on many occasions of Illud intelligence operations, prying for information about the land nations, even trying to manipulate local politics in their own favor. But as a dwarven member of the organization's central committee said at the time, "There's been no sabotage, no killings that we can link to them. In essence, their espionage is no different than what has been employed by men against dwarves, dwarves against elves, and elves against men since the world was young, except that they are better at it." Since then, the organization has maintained that hands-off stance with regard to Illud, trying to identify and infiltrate any Illud spy networks on land and to monitor their activities, but not engaging in any sabotage or killings of Illud Kuo-toa unless they cross the line first, focusing instead on the villainous, overtly evil Diluvian Empire. except that if Sturmgehor's family were killed by Kuo-toa over 400 years ago, it almost certainly would have happened on or near the coast of the Elven lands, the eastern part of the Empire, which has since split off to become Illud. He doesn't talk about that, but he has repeatedly made clear that he cannot forgive the Illud, though if he has in fact killed any of them since the peace treaty, he has managed to keep it a secret. If, though, as this brief encounter implies, he's focusing his vengeance on a specific ruling house, one might extrapolate that he must be targeting House Skolov, which is the Illud faction of the ancient Diluvian house Okov, the clan most associated with the professional military of the Kuo-toa. They are by far the largest of the ruling houses, though they still made up less than 20% of the pre-Civil War KT population. In the past, they constituted the majority of all Diluvian soldiers. Now, with significant conscription on both sides of the conflict, the ancient military culture of House Skolov and House Okov have made them the primary source of officers and strategists for both armies. The infamous Illud comic books were kind of a weird historical footnote. On the one hand, they were clearly propaganda to convince young dwarves about the invincibility of Kuo-toan monitors, but on the other hand, there was a clear objective to increase cultural tolerance by combating the clear and fairly vile stereotypes of KTs in dwarven literature. Pretty reasonable from that point of view. My episode skimmed the contents of the full series, especially the earlier books. In Book 1, the new monitor, Oru, is sent on his first mission after the trials to subdue a tribe of marauding Sahagwin bandits who had risen against their masters, and against the natural order of things. This social commentary was a little less explicit, since there's far more imagery than text in the comic books, and they mostly focus on action. But regardless, the players were more interested in how the book would represent the monitor's capabilities than anything else. In Book 1, the fighting is very one-sided, and we see Oru break bladed weapons with his bare hands, effortlessly deflect javelins, and generally one-shot the Sahagwin, all without killing them. He rounds them up and escorts them to the local Illud authorities, who put them to work in the fields with very strict supervision. But the comic doesn't actually show them being beaten as they work, and though most of the former bandits look angry, some of them are actually shown as being happy to be doing decent work. Their watchers do wield prodders, though, long poles ending in dull spear tips, which are the slave master's tool of choice, since whips don't really work underwater. It is in Book 2 that Oru battles that huge tentacled sea monster, like a giant squid but with multiple beaks. It's definitely portrayed as a more challenging fight, forcing Oru to come up with different tactics to defeat it, but he of course does so, and suffers no serious injury in the process. But he is explicitly perplexed by the presence of the beast in the shallow seas of the Illud lowlands, nowhere near the deep ocean trenches where bizarre creatures are found. In Book 3, the young monitor is called upon to protect a KT city on land, up on the Illud Plateau, from a giant who looks down and mocks his minuscule size, the giant being over 20 feet tall, and the average Kuo-toa being about dwarven height. The giant taunts him, "Monitors fight well in the ocean, but on land I am king!" To which Oru replies, "We train under sea, because water offers more resistance than air. On land, we are faster." They fight for a while, and then the giant tries to stomp him, and rather than dodge, Oru transforms his body into sand. Apparently he can do that. In sand form, he absorbs the force of the blow easily, then he glides out from underneath the foot, turns back to normal, and literally cuts off the foot at the shin. Just cuts through a 4-foot thick giant limb with his bare hand. What he does to the giant after it falls is a little gory. It is after the giant that Oru, still troubled by the quandary of the sea monster, visits a priest of Lochmal, the Diluvian name for Larathal, the harvest and weather god. When the priest awakes from his vision, he is horrified, proclaiming that the beast Oru had fought came from the Shadowfell, sent by a Mindhunter. The very name Mindhunter is portrayed as terrifying to most, but Oru, as a monitor, calmly, immediately heads back to search for it. The rest is covered in the episode, the fight against the minions called Bottom Walkers, then being paralyzed by the Mindhunter's power, only to be saved by the legendary Deathfin Unon. The success, and ironically the safety of Bankton due to the neutrality forced upon Laric by the Peace Bond Treaty, has made it the continent's diplomatic capital, as well as one of the top commercial cities, rivaled only by the dwarven capital, Tarkojan. In the embassy quarter are ambassadors of the dwarves, the elves, Illud, the humans of Vistria, and even the Eladrin, because although they live in the Feywild, their lands are intertwined with the elves of this plane. The so-called barbarians of Korostrad to the north don't have a centralized government, and while the tribes did appoint an ambassador for a short period, they gave up after a few years because they just didn't see the point. And gnomes and other races of the Feywild are too far removed to take any serious part. The gnomes in particular being a race, or a couple of related races, without any stable homeland. The ambassador of Vistria is extremely outspoken but has very little power because he's so out of the loop with his own distant, embattled country. Although, if a major emergency arose, they would contact him via expensive magic. But it was Bolraad, the Illud ambassador, who they happened to run into at the museum while they were investigating Hero Tale, along with his grumpy bodyguard. He often dealt with Maria, the woman who handled the museum's Kuatoan cultural collection, because she loved learning about the subject and tapping him for knowledge, and presumably the ambassador had very few people for company other than his fellow ambassadors, who were about as much fun as you'd expect. Though the party took everything he said with a grain of salt, to be sure, they actually really liked Bolraad and his bodyguard, the latter of whom kept openly criticizing the risks taken by his charge, and giving him back talk in a manner that really gave the impression that they'd been stuck together a long time. When Bolraad said, "What would I do without you?" his companion immediately and very flatly stated, "You'd be dead." The ambassador himself told them all how he had found a bar he loved in town, describing just what an utter dump it was. But he said he liked it there because the barkeep, a dwarf, regarded him with such overt and obvious loathing, and literally tested every gold piece he handed him with his teeth, refusing to extend him any tab despite the ambassador's moderate but obvious wealth. Bolraad kept coming back because he preferred, and took almost a sick pleasure in, the honest distrust rather than everyone else's furtive glances and talking behind his back. He also had a good story about drinking Salzo Goldbeard, the dwarven ambassador, under the table, which was as epic as it was stupid, given that Kuatoa's immunity to poison makes them effectively immune to anything resembling normal alcohol. Bolraad still liked drinking, though. He liked the strong and unusual flavors, his favorite shot being 1 part tequila, 2 parts vodka. KTs do apparently have their own drink, something that gets them buzzed, but it's closer to formaldehyde, and too hard to get a hold of when you're living so far from the ocean. More relevant, though, Bolraad did tell them about how Deathfin Unon and Deathfin Du were real, and he hinted that he knew and thought highly of Ba'ob as someone who works behind the scenes, helping those voices in Illud society who think outside the box. Bolraad also explained how he himself was something of an outsider, and though he took his post seriously, he had been sent to this far-off diplomatic office, mostly to get him out of the way, as his house considered him something of a black bull. They're pretty sure he means black sheep, but they didn't bother correcting him. One detail he did not explain to him about the Ultimate Monitors, for national security reasons, was that because of the desire to respond instantly if the enemy one were to be spotted, each of them is accompanied at all times by a spellcaster capable of casting teleport, making them less like walking tac nukes and more like ICBMs, Intercontinental Ballistic Monitors. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know if you have any questions about Tales from My D&D campaign, about the game setting, or about being a game master in general. I'm not really an expert, but I'll see what I can do.